The jungle breathed around him like a living thing, hot and wet and suffocating. And Private First Class Isaiah Cross knew that if he stopped moving now, they would both die here. His legs burned with a fire that went deeper than muscle, deeper than bone, settling somewhere in his soul where exhaustion became a physical presence he could almost see. The lieutenant's body pressed against his back. Dead weight slumped across his shoulders in a fireman's carry, blood soaking through Isaiah's already drenched uniform until he couldn't tell anymore where the officer's wounds ended and his own sweat began. Every step forward was a negotiation between his body's demand to collapse and his mind's refusal to let it happen. And somewhere in that impossible space between wanting to die and refusing to quit, Isaiah Cross kept walking. The sounds of the firefight had faded maybe an hour ago, maybe 3. Time losing all meaning in the green hell of Peleliu's interior where the Japanese had turned coral. Ridges into killing grounds and every shadow might hide a spider hole. Isaiah's platoon had been pinned down on a ridge designated only as Hill 100 on maps that meant nothing to the men bleeding out on its slopes. And when the mortar rounds started walking up the incline with methodical precision, Lieutenant Harrison had pushed Isaiah behind an outcropping just before the world exploded in white phosphorus and coral, fragments that tore through flesh like heated razors. The lieutenant had been standing when the round hit. Isaiah had been alive because he'd been shoved down, and in that fraction of a second between salvation and catastrophe, everything Isaiah believed about the Marine Corps and his place in it had shattered like the coral beneath the blast. Harrison was white. Harrison was his officer. Harrison shouldn't have cared whether a black Marine lived or died beyond what it meant for his roster and mission effectiveness, and yet there the man was, sprawled on the ground with his legs shredded and his eyes rolling back in his head. And Isaiah had made a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, because some things mattered more than the color lines drawn across a country that called itself free. "Stay with me, sir," Isaiah whispered now, his voice cracking through lips split by dehydration and the coral dust that coated everything. "Stay with me." The lieutenant's only response was a wet, ragged breathing that bubbled with blood, and Isaiah adjusted the body on his shoulders and kept moving through jungles so thick he sometimes had to turn sideways to slip. Between trees, moving south by instinct and desperation because the company's last position had been somewhere in that direction before everything went to hell. 6 miles. That's what the sergeant had said when they'd studied the maps that morning, a lifetime ago before the shooting started. 6 miles from Hill 100 to the battalion aid station at Purple Beach. Though the actual distance through Peleliu's nightmare terrain would be twice that, maybe more. Isaiah had covered maybe 2 miles so far and his legs were already trembling with each step. Muscles screaming for rest that he couldn't give them, wouldn't give them, because stopping meant dying and he'd survived too much to die on this godforsaken island carrying a man who'd saved his life. The weight wasn't just the lieutenant's body. It was everything that body represented, every contradiction, every complexity, every impossible truth about being a black man in an American uniform fighting a war for a country that had made it abundantly clear he was something less than human. Isaiah's mind drifted back to Montford Point, that segregated training facility outside Camp Lewan, where the Marine Corps had grudgingly accepted its first black recruits after President Roosevelt's executive order had forced their hand. The white Marines had gotten Camp Lejeune itself, with its proper barracks and equipment and instructors who at least pretended to believe in the men they were training. The black Marines had gotten Montford Point, a patch of swampland and crude facilities where drill instructors both black and white had pushed them harder than any white recruit was pushed, knowing that every mistake, every failure would be used as evidence that Negroes had no business in the Corps. Isaiah had been 19 years old and full of the kind of burning purpose that only the young and idealistic could sustain, determined to prove something to people who would never see him as equal no matter how well he performed. His father had fought in the Great War with the 92nd Division, had come home to Mississippi with medals and shrapnel and the crushing realization that heroism changed nothing when your skin was the wrong color. "Don't go, son," his father had said when Isaiah announced his enlistment. "Don't bleed for people who hate you." But Isaiah had gone anyway, driven by something he couldn't fully articulate even to himself, some stubborn belief that courage mattered, that service mattered, that proving yourself under fire would force America to see you as a man. Montford Point had tried to beat that idealism out of him, replacing it with something harder and more practical. But here he was on Peleliu carrying a white officer through hell, and maybe his father had been right all along. The drill instructors at Montford Point had been merciless, sensing the weight of history on their shoulders, knowing that the entire experiment of black Marines would be judged by how well these first recruits performed. Sergeant Major Foster, a black man who'd clawed his way up through decades of service in the Army before transferring to help train the Marine Corps' first Negro recruits, had been particularly unforgiving. You think the enemy gonna go easy on you because you black? He'd roared during a particularly brutal training exercise where Isaiah's squad had failed to secure their objective. You think the Japs gonna check your skin color before they put a bullet in your head? You're Marines now, and that means you better be twice as good as any white boy just to be seen as half as capable. That's the deal, and if you can't handle it, go home. Isaiah hadn't gone home. None of them had. They'd endured the training, endured the open contempt from white Marines who made it clear that the corps they loved was being polluted. By the presence of Negroes, endured the knowledge that even after proving themselves they'd be assigned to segregated units and given support roles because white commanders didn't trust black men with the real fighting. Ammunition handlers, shore party, stevedores, that's what Montford Point Marines were supposed to be. Moving supplies while white Marines did the actual combat. Except the Pacific War had a way of erasing artificial distinctions when the shooting started. And when Japanese defenders turned landing beaches into charnel houses, everyone who could hold a rifle found themselves in the fight, whether the Marine Corps' racial policies approved or not. Isaiah's unit had been unloading supplies at Purple Beach when the counterattack came, and suddenly they were Marines first and black second, fighting with whatever weapons they could grab while white officers screamed orders and men died without regard to the color of their skin. That's where Isaiah had first encountered Lieutenant Harrison, a young officer from Pennsylvania who'd arrived at Peleliu, with the naive assumption that men who wore the same uniform should be treated the same way. Harrison had been assigned to coordinate with the shore party units, which meant working with Montford Point Marines, and he'd approached the assignment without the visible disgust that characterized most white officers. Interactions with black troops. He'd learned their names, asked about their training, listened when Isaiah's sergeant explained supply chain logistics with the expertise of a man who understood his job better than the white officers who looked down on him. And when that counterattack had come screaming out of the jungle, Harrison had fought alongside Isaiah's unit like it was the most natural thing in the world, directing fire and hauling ammunition and dragging wounded men to cover without ever asking what color they were. Isaiah had seen him put his body between a wounded black Marine and incoming fire, taking coral fragments in his shoulder rather than let the man behind him get hit. And in that moment, Isaiah had begun to understand that the world was more complicated than the simple categories of oppressor and oppressed his father had tried to teach him. Now Harrison was the wounded man, and Isaiah was the one who wouldn't let him die, and the jungle closed around them like a fist. A sound froze, Isaiah mid-step voices speaking Japanese, close enough that he could hear individual words even though he didn't understand them. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly lowered himself and the lieutenant behind a massive fallen tree, its trunk wide enough to provide cover if he could stay absolutely still and absolutely silent. The lieutenant moaned, a low sound of agony that seemed impossibly loud in the jungle's humid quiet, and Isaiah pressed his hand gently over the man's mouth, leaning close to whisper directly into his ear. "Sir, I need you to stay quiet. Enemy patrol. Stay quiet and stay still." Harrison's eyes flickered open, unfocused and glassy with shock and blood loss. But some part of him understood because he bit down on whatever scream was trying to escape and nodded fractionally. Isaiah kept his hand in place, feeling the lieutenant's labored breathing against his palm, feeling his own pulse pounding in his temples as the Japanese voices grew louder. They were searching, Isaiah realized. The patrol was moving methodically through the jungle, probably looking for survivors from the earlier fighting, and if they followed the trail of disturbed undergrowth and blood that Isaiah and Harrison had left behind, this would end badly for both of them. Isaiah's rifle was slung across his back, impossible to bring to bear without moving and making noise, and his kabar knife was sheathed at his belt, within reach but useless against multiple enemies. His only weapon was stillness. His only defense was the jungle's chaotic growth and the hope that Japanese eyes would pass over their hiding place without seeing. The soldiers materialized from the green shadows like ghosts, 4 of them moving in a loose skirmish line, rifles held ready, eyes scanning the terrain. They were Imperial Army, not the naval troops that had defended Peleliu's beach, which meant they were part of the reinforcements that had been filtering onto the island through the northern caves. Good soldiers, experienced, the kind of men who wouldn't miss obvious signs of passage. One of them stopped, perhaps 15 feet from Isaiah's position, his head tilting as he studied something on the ground. Blood. It had to be blood, a trail of it leading directly to the fallen tree. And Isaiah felt his muscles coil with the terrible certainty that he was about to have to kill or be killed, and either way, the noise would bring more enemies, and Harrison would die here because Isaiah hadn't been strong enough or smart enough or lucky enough to save him. The soldier took a step forward. Another. His rifle came up fractionally, covering the tree line, and Isaiah's hand moved with glacial slowness toward his knife, preparing for the violent explosion that would come when the enemy rounded the tree trunk and saw them huddled there. 3 seconds. 2. 1. An explosion somewhere to the north shattered the jungle's tension. The heavy crump of artillery or naval gunfire, and the Japanese soldiers' heads snapped toward the sound in perfect unison. Their leader barked something sharp and urgent, and the patrol was moving again, heading toward the explosion at a jog, and then they were gone, and Isaiah was still alive and still hidden and still holding a hand over his lieutenant's mouth to keep him quiet. He waited 5 minutes. 10. Counting his own heartbeats because his watch had been smashed hours ago and time was measured now only in moments of survival, when he finally moved again, lifting Harrison back onto his shoulders with a grunt of effort that sent white lightning through his abused muscles. The jungle seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper, as if the close call had used up some finite reserve of luck that he couldn't afford to lose. "Still with me, sir," Isaiah whispered. "Cross," Harrison's voice was barely audible, thick with pain and confusion. "Cross, leave me. Get yourself out." "Not happening, Lieutenant. That's an order, Marine." Isaiah kept walking, adjusting the body on his shoulders, feeling blood run down his back in sticky rivulets. "Sir, with respect, I've been taking orders from white men my whole life. And the one thing I've learned is knowing which orders are worth following. You saved my life on that ridge. I'm not leaving you to die because of it." Harrison made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Impossible to tell which. "Stubborn, yes, sir. All us Montford Point Marines are stubborn. It's in the training." The conversation used up too much of Harrison's remaining strength, and he fell silent again, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts in the endless green cathedral of the jungle, and the weight that was both physical and spiritual pressing down on his shoulders. His feet found purchase on root systems and coral outcroppings, each step a small victory against gravity and exhaustion and the body's insistent demand to stop. Somewhere behind them, more artillery thundered, the sounds of war a distant counterpoint to their private struggle for survival. Isaiah's mind drifted back to another conversation, this one at Montford Point during the brief hours between training exercises when the recruits could talk about something other than killing and dying. James Wilson, a kid from Chicago who'd enlisted with dreams of proving something to a father who'd never believed in him, had posed the question that all of them carried but few spoke aloud. Why are we doing this? Why are we fighting for people who treat us like we're not even human? The answers had varied. Some said it was about proving themselves, showing the country that black men could be Marines, could be warriors, could be heroes. Others said it was about the principle of the thing, about fighting fascism abroad even while Jim Crow thrived at home, about the hope that service might change minds and hearts and eventually laws. A few had been honest enough to admit they'd had no real choice, that the draft would have taken them anyway, and at least as volunteers they'd had some say in their branch and fate. Isaiah had struggled to articulate his own reasons, finally settling on something that felt true, even if it was complicated and incomplete. "I'm fighting for the man next to me," he'd said. "For the Marines in my unit, black or white or whatever. When the shooting starts, that's all that matters. The rest of it, all the politics and racism and whether America deserves us, that's for after. Right now I'm fighting so my brothers make it home." Wilson had died on Saipan, cut down by machine gun fire during a banzai charge that had come screaming out of the darkness with the fury of men who preferred death to surrender. Isaiah had held him as he bled out, had promised to write his mother in Chicago, had carried that weight forward to the next battle and the next because there was no other choice. No way to process the grief and rage and helplessness except to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. Now he was carrying Harrison, and the irony wasn't lost on him that the man on his shoulders represented everything his father had warned him about: white authority, white power, the system that had crushed black dreams for centuries. Except Harrison had pushed him out of the way of that mortar round, had chosen to shield a black Marine with his own body, and that single act had rewritten everything Isaiah thought he understood about the fixed categories of race and hate and who could be trusted. The jungle began to thin slightly, the dense undergrowth giving way to more open terrain that offered better visibility but also exposed them to potential observation. Isaiah moved more carefully now, using available cover, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of enemy movement. His legs were beyond pain, operating on some reserve of will that existed independent of physical capacity, and he could feel tremors running through his muscles that warned of imminent collapse. 2 more miles, maybe 3. He'd lost all real sense of distance, measuring progress only by landmarks half remembered from the pre-battle briefings: that burned-out tank, that distinctive coral formation, that cluster of palm trees shredded by artillery. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they didn't signal the approaching darkness that would make navigation nearly impossible. Moving through Peleliu's jungle at night was suicide, an invitation for every possible disaster, from stepping on mines to walking into Japanese positions to simply getting lost and wandering until exhaustion and dehydration finished what the enemy couldn't. But stopping meant dying too. meant Harrison bleeding out in the darkness while Isaiah huddled beside him uselessly, and neither option was acceptable. So he kept walking. Even as the light failed and the shadows grew long and the jungle transformed into something more primal and threatening. His foot caught on a root and he nearly went down, catching himself at the last second but jarring Harrison hard enough that the lieutenant cried out in pain, a sharp sound that echoed through the trees like a gunshot. Isaiah froze, listening, waiting for the inevitable response of enemy soldiers converging on their position. Nothing. Just the ambient sounds of the jungle at dusk, insects beginning their nightly chorus, distant birds calling, the susurrus of wind through leaves. Isaiah exhaled slowly and adjusted his grip on Harrison's body and kept moving through the gathering darkness. "Tell me about home, Cross." Harrison's voice emerged from the darkness, weak but coherent, the voice of a man fighting to stay conscious and connected to the world. "Tell me anything. Need to hear something besides this goddamn jungle." Isaiah's throat was too dry for easy talking, his voice emerging as a rasp that hurt coming out. "Not much to tell, sir. Mississippi, small town. Cotton and tobacco mostly. My father worked a farm, sharecropping, trying to save enough to buy his own land someday. Never did manage it. Family, father, mother, 2 sisters. Mother wanted me to be a teacher, thought education was the way up and out. My sisters are both smarter than me, might actually make something of themselves." Isaiah paused, breathing hard, adjusting his burden. "What about you, Lieutenant?" "Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, father's a lawyer. Wanted me to follow him into the practice." Harrison's laugh was bitter. Disappointed the hell out of him when I enlisted. Said I was throwing away opportunity, that men like me didn't need to prove anything by dying in some Pacific jungle. Guess he might have been right. "You're not dying, sir. Not tonight. Not on my watch. Why Cross?" The question carried weight beyond its simple syllables. "Why are you doing this? I'm nobody to you. Just another white officer in a corps that treats you like you're less than human. You could leave me, report I was already dead when you found me. Nobody would question it. Nobody would blame you." Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds his labored breathing and the rhythm of his footsteps crunching through undergrowth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the accumulated weight of Montford Point and Mississippi and every moment of his life where he'd been forced to be better than everyone else just to be seen as barely adequate. "Because it's the right thing to do, sir. Because you shielded me from that mortar when you could have saved yourself. Because I've spent my whole life having people tell me what I'm worth based on my skin color, and I'll be damned if I become what they say I am. I'm a Marine. Marines don't leave their own behind. Black or white officer or enlisted, I'm a Marine, and that means something, even if the Corps doesn't always remember it." Harrison was silent for several heartbeats, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion that went beyond physical pain. "I'm sorry, Cross, for all of it. The segregation, the Montford Point bullshit, the way the Corps treats you. You're 10 times the Marine most of the white boys will ever be, and you shouldn't have to prove it like this. Don't need your apology, sir. Just need you to stay alive long enough for me to get you to the aid station. You can apologize on behalf of the whole Marine Corps after that if it makes you feel better." They lapsed into silence after that, Harrison conserving his strength, Isaiah conserving his breath for the endless trudge through darkness that was now nearly complete. He moved by feel and instinct, keeping his sense of direction by the position of stars visible through breaks in the canopy, trusting his training and his desperation to guide him toward safety. Twice more he heard enemy patrols close enough that he had to take cover and wait them out, each delay eating in a time that Harrison didn't have, each pause a test of Isaiah's failing endurance. His body was shutting down incrementally, systems starting to fail under the accumulated weight of physical trauma and exhaustion. His vision was narrowing at the edges, dark spots floating in his peripheral awareness. His hands had gone numb hours ago, locked in a grip on Harrison's body that he wasn't sure he could release even if he tried. His legs moved through pure muscle memory, each step a mechanical action disconnected from conscious thought. And still he walked, because stopping was death, and he decided somewhere back on that ridge that he wasn't going to let death have either of them tonight. The moon rose, a pale crescent that provided barely enough light to navigate by, and Isaiah used it gratefully, picking his way through terrain that had become a surreal landscape of shadows and strange shapes. His mind began to play tricks on him, showing him things that weren't there, his mother standing by a tree beckoning him home, James Wilson walking beside him grinning and talking about Chicago, his father in his old army uniform watching with an expression Isaiah couldn't read. "Stay with me, Cross," Harrison whispered, and Isaiah realized the lieutenant was talking to him now, not the other way around, keeping him focused and moving when his body wanted to quit. "Stay with me, Marine. You've come too far to stop now." "Yes, sir," Isaiah whispered back, and the words themselves became a cadence, a rhythm to match his footsteps. Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. The jungle began to change. Subtle differences that Isaiah's trained awareness recognized even through his exhaustion-cleared lanes of fire. Defensive positions, the smell of canvas and cooking fires, and the distinctive odor of American positions. He was close. Had to be close. The thought gave him a burst of energy that came from nowhere and everywhere, adrenaline or desperation or simple stubborn refusal to quit when the finish line was finally visible. Halt. Identify yourself. The challenge came from the darkness ahead, an American voice tight with tension, and Isaiah wanted to weep with relief at the sound of it. Private First Class Isaiah Cross, shore party carrying wounded officer. His voice cracked on the words, barely recognizable as his own. Don't shoot. For the love of God, don't shoot. Advance and be recognized. Isaiah stumbled forward into a cleared area where foxholes and fighting positions formed a defensive perimeter, and suddenly there were figures emerging from the shadows, white Marines with rifles and suspicious eyes. And Isaiah was too exhausted to care what they thought or how they saw him. He'd made it. Against all odds and reason, he'd made it. Jesus Christ, someone breathed. He carried him all the way from Hill 100. Get a corpsman. Now, where the hell did he come from? Isaiah felt hands taking Harrison from his shoulders. Felt a sudden absence of weight like a physical shock, and his legs buckled immediately, unable to support even his own body without the burden they'd carried for so many miles. He went down hard on his knees, gasping for air, unable to process what was happening around him. A corpsman was working on Harrison, barking orders, calling for plasma and sulfa powder and a stretcher. Other Marines clustered around, white faces staring at Isaiah with expressions he was too tired to interpret. He waited for the dismissal, the casual racism that would reduce his impossible journey to just another Negro doing his job. Nothing special, nothing worth remembering. Instead, one of the Marines, a sergeant with 1st Division patches, a man who'd clearly seen his share of fighting, stepped forward and extended a hand to help Isaiah to his feet. That was something, Marine. That was really something. Isaiah took the hand, let himself be pulled upright, swayed dangerously as his legs threatened to give out again. The sergeant steadied him, and then something extraordinary happened. The sergeant stepped back, came to attention, and rendered a salute. Not the casual, half-hearted gesture that white Marines sometimes gave black enlisted men as a form of mockery, but a real salute, crisp and proper and laden with respect that transcended rank and race and everything the Marine. Cora had tried to make absolute, and then one by one, every Marine in that defensive position came to attention and saluted. A dozen men standing in the moonlight and acknowledging something that couldn't be reduced to words or regulations. They were saluting courage. They were saluting determination. They were saluting a Marine who'd done what shouldn't have been possible, who'd carried his officer through 6 miles of hell and refused to quit even when quitting would have been understandable and forgivable. Isaiah stood there, too exhausted to return the salute properly, too overwhelmed to speak, and felt something crack open inside him that had been frozen since Montford Point. These men saw him. Really saw him, not as a black Marine or a Negro or some experiment in racial integration, but as a warrior who'd proven himself under conditions that would have broken most men. The moment stretched and expanded, becoming more than just a gesture of military courtesy, becoming a recognition of shared humanity that the war had tried to destroy and men like Isaiah had fought to preserve. Get him water, the sergeant said quietly, breaking the spell, and get him to the aid station. He looks half dead. Sir, Isaiah's voice emerged as a croak. The lieutenant, he's alive, Marine. Thanks to you, he's alive. Now let us take care of you. They led him to a foxhole and gave him a canteen, and someone produced a can of peaches that tasted like heaven. Despite his nauseous exhaustion, he sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the perimeter settling back into watchful tension, listening to the corpsmen working on Harrison 50 feet away, listening to his own heart slowly returning to something approaching a normal rhythm. A white captain approached, a man with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who'd commanded Marines in combat long enough to know what actually mattered. Private Cross, I'm Captain Morrison, Battalion Executive Officer. Lieutenant Harrison is being stabilized now, but the corpsmen say he wouldn't have survived another hour without treatment. You saved his life. Isaiah didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just nodded and took another sip of water. Morrison crouched down beside him, speaking quietly. I'm going to recommend you for the Navy Cross. What you did tonight, that's beyond the call of duty, Marine. That's heroism of the highest order. Just did what needed doing, sir. Isaiah's voice was flat, too tired for pride or false modesty. He saved me first. I was just paying it back. It's more than that, and you know it. Morrison's hand came to rest briefly on Isaiah's shoulder, a gesture of connection and respect. Get some rest, Private. You've earned it, and the captain left, and Isaiah sat alone in the foxhole as the night deepened around him, feeling the accumulated weight of the last 12 hours settling into his bones like lead. He thought about his father in Mississippi, wondered what the old man would say about tonight, about a black Marine saving a white officer's life and being saluted by white Marines for doing it. Would his father see it as progress, as proof that courage could transcend the barriers of race and hate? Or would he see it as just another way the system used black men up, trading their sacrifice for the illusion of equality that would evaporate as soon as the shooting stopped? Isaiah didn't have answers. He just had the memory of Harrison's weight on his shoulders, the impossible miles through darkness and enemy territory. The moment when those Marines had come to attention and saluted him like he was someone who mattered. He had survived. Harrison had survived. For tonight in this small corner of hell on Peleliu, that would have to be enough. He dozed fitfully in the foxhole, waking at every sound, his body still thrumming with adrenaline despite his exhaustion. Dawn came slowly, painting the jungle in shades of gray and then gold. And with the morning light came a jeep that would take wounded men back to the beach and the hospital ship waiting offshore. They loaded Harrison onto a stretcher, his face pale but his eyes open and aware, and as they lifted him into the jeep, he caught Isaiah's gaze and held it. "Thank you, Cross," Harrison said, his voice weak but clear. "I won't forget this, ever. Just get better, sir." "That's thanks enough." The jeep drove away, leaving Isaiah standing in the morning light, still covered in blood and coral dust and the residue of the previous night's impossible journey. The Marines who'd saluted him the night before were busy with morning routines, checking weapons and eating rations and preparing for another day of fighting. But Isaiah caught nods and quiet words of respect from men who'd witnessed what he'd done. It wasn't much. It wouldn't change the Marine Corps' segregation policies or erase the racism that permeated American society or undo the century of oppression that had brought him to this moment. But it was something, a small crack in the wall that divided human beings into categories of worthy and unworthy. And sometimes small cracks were where the light got in. A black sergeant from another shore party unit found Isaiah later that morning, a man named Williams who'd survived Tarawa and Saipan and carried the weight of those battles in his eyes. "Heard what you did last night," Williams said quietly, words spreading. "Every black Marine on this island is going to hear about it by tonight." "It's not a big deal," Isaiah protested, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's a huge deal. Private. You just showed every white Marine on Peleliu that we're every bit as capable as they are, that will fight and bleed and sacrifice for our brothers in arms regardless of their color. You just proved what we've been saying since Montford Point, that we belong here, that we're Marines, that we deserve to be treated with respect." Williams paused, his expression intense. "You carried more than just Lieutenant Harrison last night. You carried all of us. Every Montford Point Marine. Every black man who's ever worn this uniform and wondered if it meant anything. You carried our dignity, our pride, our right to be here. Don't ever diminish that." Isaiah felt tears stinging his eyes, too exhausted and overwhelmed to hold them back. He thought about the drill instructors at Montford Point, about the impossible standards they'd enforced, about the stated and unstated reasons why black Marines had to be perfect when white Marines could afford to be merely adequate. He thought about his father's warnings, about James Wilson dying on Saipan, about every moment of the past 2 years when he'd questioned whether his service meant anything at all. And he thought about Lieutenant Harrison pushing him out of the way of that mortar round, about the weight of a man's life carried through darkness, about white Marines standing at attention in moonlight and offering a salute that meant something because it came from genuine respect, rather than regulatory requirement. "We're going to win this war," Williams said quietly, "and when we do, things are going to change. Not immediately, not easily, but they're going to change. Because men like you proved that all the racist bullshit about black inferiority is exactly that bullshit. You proved it last night in a way that nobody can deny or diminish. That matters, Cross. That matters more than you know." Isaiah nodded, unable to speak, and Williams gripped his shoulder briefly before walking away, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts and his exhaustion and the strange, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the sacrifice meant something beyond the immediate horror of the war. The story of that night spread across Peleliu and beyond, carried by the informal network of Marines who traded tales of courage and survival, embellished slightly with each retelling until Isaiah barely recognized himself in the mythologized version. A black Marine carried his white officers 6 miles through enemy territory. The story went, refused to leave him behind, brought him in alive against all odds. And when he arrived, exhausted and half dead, a white platoon stood at attention and saluted him like he was a general, recognizing courage that transcended the barriers of race. Isaiah would carry Lieutenant Harrison's weight for the rest of his life, not as burden but as badge, not as trauma but as testament to the complicated truth that courage and sacrifice could exist even inside broken systems, that individual acts of heroism could challenge collective prejudice, that sometimes the weight of a man's life was exactly what was needed to prove that all lives carried equal value. He survived Peleliu, he survived Okinawa, he came home to Mississippi with medals that didn't open doors or change laws or make white people see him differently, but he came home knowing that he'd proven something essential about himself and the men who'd trained beside him at Montford Point. He came home carrying Lieutenant Harrison's weight, and in carrying that weight, he'd also carried forward the cause of every black Marine who'd come before and every one who'd come after, proving through blood and determination and 6 impossible miles that courage knew no color, and that the uniform meant something beyond the prejudices of the men who wore it. Years later, when the Marine Corps finally desegregated and Montford Point became a historical site rather than a necessary compromise, Isaiah would think about that night on Peleliu and feel a complicated pride. The salute those white Marines had given him hadn't changed the world, but it had changed them, and they'd carried that change forward into a future where maybe someday a black Marine wouldn't have to do the impossible just to be seen as equal. He'd carried Lieutenant Harrison 6 miles through hell, but in doing so, he'd also carried forward the dream of a country that could be better than its prejudices, a Marine Corps that could be more than its segregated past, a world where courage would finally matter more than color. The weight had been unbearable, but Isaiah Cross had refused to put it down, and in that refusal he'd helped carry forward something larger than himself, something that would outlast the war and the pain and the impossible, journey through darkness toward a dawn he'd helped create.